to our talk with Vargas-Suarez Universal on his current show Time and Space Fabric at Hutchinson Modern and Contemporary. Let's get started with brief introductions. I'm Tenzin Lama, a Kathmandu and New York-based independent curator, consultant, and archivist. After the pleasure of writing an essay for Vargas-Suarez Universal's upcoming monograph, titled Vectors and Methods, I'm thrilled to conduct this artist talk. Now, a short introduction of the show Time and Space Fabric. Time and Space Fabric includes the first textile works produced by Vargas-Suarez Universal in Kyrgyzstan and Nepal since 2018, and works on paper from 2012 that became textile works. Vargas-Suarez Universal's interest in textiles, weaving, and fabrics stemmed from a lifetime fascination with the origins and development of computer technologies. The labyrinthian designs you will spectate in his show emulate designs that also emphasize the integral relationship between structure and design derived from scientific studies of outer space. For the convenience of the talk, I'll address you as VSU. This talk or discussion should provide a comprehensive insight into VSU's work, creative process, and the unique blend of art and science that defines his artistic practice. Little about VSU himself. VSU was born in Mexico City and raised in Houston. VSU studied astronomy and art history at the University of Texas at Austin and moved to New York City in 1997. Even though he's a true multidisciplinary artist, he's primarily known for his large-scale murals, paintings, drawings, and sound recordings. He sources American and Russian spaceflight programs, astronomy, and aerospace architecture to create commissioned, studio-based, and public artworks for museums, galleries, private and public spaces. VSU's study of the topographies of various spacewalks to map them directly onto his paintings and drawings uses vectors and other geometric formulas and forms that are clearly informed by his scientific background in astronomical studies. His body of works build upon this tradition by depicting futuristic space exploration and otherworldly landscapes, constantly expanding the boundaries of our current perspective. Let's move on to our talk now. Good afternoon, Vargas.
Hi, Tenzin. Thank you for having me. And I also want to thank the gallery and Modern, where I currently have the exhibition. And so, yeah, let's get started.
I'd like to begin with the theme of influences and background. Your work often integrates and weaves scientific data and visualizations from spaceflight programs. Did your upbringing near NASA's Johnson Space Center influence your artistic vision and interest in space early on?
Yeah, growing up literally surrounded by the children and of astronauts and engineers and scientists, but also having those people as my neighbors. And growing up in that culture, I didn't think at the time it informed me what I was going to do as an adult. I was much more at the time interested in music and architecture and sports. But as I got older, I started appreciating really the uniqueness of growing up in such an environment. So by the time I decided to do my university studies, I realized that astronomy was going to inform me quite a bit in terms of subject matter. I was also very much interested in architecture. I was also interested in art history as a teenager. So by the time I was in school and by the time I moved to New York, I had it very clear that the natural world and the sciences and technology were going to inform me in ways that I still am discovering.
Thank you. Shifting from the biographical note, I'd like to ask you about your journey through time and space. I'm astonished at how you currently operate from 3 different places, Nepal, Kyrgyzstan, and the States. traveling with your archival works to execute it in different traditions. What are some of the challenges of working from multiple locations? Also, what are the advantages you found in working across these diverse environments?
Well, there's many challenges, there's many benefits, there's many pros and cons. The biggest challenge is having to adapt to a local set of knowledge, a local set of rules to be able to make art. Coming from the West, being a Western artist in another part of the world, you're definitely not, you don't fit in immediately. You have to build relationships. You have to build a very strong dialogue. And over time, the language barrier, the time difference, having meetings and having calls and scheduling and coordinating things on the opposite side of the world, whether I'm here in the US or I'm on that side over there, it's always challenging. And so, you know, whether I think again, whether I'm creating something new, working with someone, collaborating with someone, as you know, you're also curating in Nepal. So it's, you know, understandably, there's always that room for error, but then again, you have to be able to adapt. The benefits are quite vast. One is that I'm continuously learning. I consider myself a student at all times. So I'm continuously learning, and all this travel really exposes all of us. Travel is just great education. So I feel like I'm continuously learning what I can possibly do with my work. And again, having that dialogue with local artisans, with local artists, with local audiences is always really rewarding. So there's again pros and cons, but I think that finding that balance is always key.
Thank you for putting your experiences in such poignant and personal manner. Now I'd like to share some of the paper works in the show. Please bear with me. Vector 17, first of all, and then vector 53, vector 44 and 45. Are these works on paper from 2012 to 2014 ultimately
Yeah,
going to be large-scale works?
let's go back to the 2012 one, or the first one.
Okay.
Yeah, so this piece here is actually from a group that I made this paper. I was fortunate enough to learn how to make paper. I was awarded a residency at Dudonne Paper Mill in New York City, and I was able to work with abaca, with cotton, with silk, with papyrus. And afterwards, I took it upon myself to make more paper. So for me, paper is a place. It's an organic, natural material. And so for me, paper is a place where really incredible things can happen. And so I almost feel like the fibers themselves are these little channels and conduits to be able to work with and work in and out of, and literally weave your imagination in and out of these fibers. So for example, in this drawing, I had this challenge of having this very organic material, and I wanted to put something very hard edge, very linear, very sort of logical based array of vectors. And so from this kind of drawing, we can move to the next drawing. I also wanted to introduce color and pigments. So by 2014, I had been traveling through Turkey and Asia. And so I was starting to bring back pigments from, say, India and Turkey specifically, and working with these pigments to be able to produce my own colors for some of this handmade paper. And if we go to the next slide, I was also, again, going back to this idea of rigidity and kind of like ideas, drawings based on geometries from microchips and technology, things like that. So kind of always trying to find that balance between the organic and the inorganic. And so in these two drawings, which come from a larger set called vector groups, which ran into almost 130 pieces. They started looking to me almost like textiles. And so it wasn't until 2015 and 16 that I kind of in my memory, went back to these drawings and started thinking about them as possibilities for textiles.
I also wanted to know during your journeys back and forth, when did you first have the epiphany of collaborating with local artisans?
So in 2015, I was awarded a commission by the American University in Central Asia in Kyrgyzstan. So I went there in 2015, and I quickly realized that I would need to work with local artisans to be able to produce a large piece using silk. So then working with silk experts, people who do embroidery and sewing on silk, I quickly realized, okay, they're experts. I can learn a lot from them. And how do I take what I can learn from them and apply it into my works? So by 2015 and 2016, I was finishing that project. And in 2018, I went back to Kyrgyzstan on my own account, without a project, without any kind of purpose other than hiring master artisans to learn really the techniques of felting, which are the techniques of most famous techniques of Central Asia, which is called shirdak, which is a kind of quilting and patchwork. Another one is called alakigis, which means painting with wool. So these are the most traditional techniques. There's also a technique called chi, which there's a great example in the exhibition next to a watercolor. And so learning these techniques, again, having these communities accept a Western artist, a total outsider, bring in completely different ideas into their traditions, was a little bit challenging at first. But once people understood what the possibilities were with my work, they very quickly start getting very motivated and start giving you ideas, and there starts a very interesting dialogue. So that sort of evolved very organically, and that's kind of how I always work. I let things evolve organically. You can't force certain mediums. You can fight with a painting for years, but with textiles, you sort of let the organic side of it really guide you.
Also, your work embraces both the worlds, reclaiming indigeneity and re-enchanting science at the same time. I believe you've mentioned before about being master artisan student, exchanging your expertise. This mode of tandem is very interesting to me. I mostly wanted to know what kind of narratives can you draw on the state of these individual and indigenous artisanship from your direct experiences.
Well, what's interesting about that is that each project, each body of work creates its own narrative because of the nature of the materials or the process itself, or also the actual artworks, the content of the artworks themselves. So when you're working with somebody who's an expert on silk, you're immersed in silk world. You're in the Silk Road. You're in Kyrgyzstan. You're well aware of what's happening with silk in India, in China, in Uzbekistan, in Iran. And so you're just flooded with all kinds of information and the sets of possibilities and ideas, that you can explore. Working with wool, it's interesting because it's this completely other realm. I like to go where the actual sheep are, where the animals are. I like to know their diets. I like to know the, you know, where they eat, where they sleep, the mating season, how they cut the hair, how they process this wool from raw animal hair into finished, even merino wool and very fine wool. And so a lot of these artisans are very well versed, very immersed, multi-generationally, some of them. And so they know a lot about wool in other countries too, say in Scotland and New Zealand as well. They're very knowledgeable about other types of wool around the world. So each kind of project, each body of work has its own narrative. And I'm a good documentarian of all these processes. So I'm always even looking at my own documentation to fully understand what I'm truly involved in at the moment. And so, these are people who have been focused and dedicated on a specific material or a specific technique for a long time. And so really learning as much as I can from them, and shorter periods of time is really vital.
Now, a general question in relation to what you've said. How do you feel about pushing these skills and artisanships to the fine arts and design realm?
Well, that's a question I've asked myself so many times, especially in the last few years, because there just used to be such a separation of, say, the fine arts and craft, and those distinctions are pretty much blurred these days. I feel like we're all, no matter what medium or what material we're working with, you can apply pretty much any material or process or technique and mix things up. Um, it's like the possibilities are endless these days. So that's very exciting. One of the things that I really want to research more and more, I've been researching a little bit for the last 10 years, but now I want to get more into it, is actually how textiles are being developed for use in aerospace, for inflatable habitats, for, say, structures on the moon, on Mars, or else or beyond. Fibers and textile fibers are being discovered to have very great qualities for these types of applications, and with new technologies and new materials, but at the same time using even ancient and traditional textile structures and weaving structures with new materials. So that's very exciting. I've been learning a lot about several companies here in the US. They're looking at literally basket weaving from the Amazon and from Navajo women to develop inflatable structures for space.
There is something very primal about your works. Hence, I want to ask you, does colors exist in most of the indigenous artisanships you're involved with? Do you believe that there is a gradual inclination to accept color in contemporary indigenous works, creating a new definition of contemporaneity itself? Or color was always present in most indigenous works you've encountered?
I think that depends on the cultures. For some cultures, and depending on the works that we would be talking about, is some of them have, religious purposes. Some of them are for decoration. Some of them have, different meanings. And it also depends on what kind of natural pigments different people have been able to source from the earth. So it's always very interesting to understand the history of color. I originally understood color from a Western European history, right? From painting, from the medieval and Baroque and the Renaissance and all the way to modernism. But it's interesting also to learn about the histories of colors in other cultures, and the question of, color in relation to indigeneity. I think it's just naturally occurring that people want to make very beautiful, very attractive things, especially if they are things that are considered important or sacred in different cultures. And ornament and elaborate design and complexity, I think, also lends itself very interesting to color. And so I think it's a case by case, but color is such a powerful uh, agent for any of these kinds of works. I've I've slowly moved more and more into color for my work. I'm not a colorist naturally. I've had to really give myself a very strong reason of why to use a specific color. I've been able to work with master artisans, especially in Kyrgyzstan, who have a very keen sense of color, and they have their reasons for that, and they have a history of how they arrived at those colors. So that's always something that I'm thinking about in terms of what is the meaning of color in the work? Why is a color so important? So that's always in development.
I'm sure the master artisans feel equally indebted by your contribution. Moving on to our next section, artistic categorization. How do you feel about your work recently being affiliated with Indigenous futurism?
I honestly have no idea or even uh I guess it doesn't affect me to think of what anybody could categorize my work as. You know, when I'm in different parts of the world, people are gonna see me in different ways. And so it's you know, as a curator, it takes a long time to figure out what some art is really about, what an art movement is, what a category consists of. And so we'll see how that pans out. I mean, I've heard so many different descriptions. I don't argue any of them against them. I don't fully embrace any of them either. I'm somebody who tends to let time sort things out.
What are your thoughts on the various genres your work is associated with within Western canon, including post-painterly abstraction and neo-abstractionism, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, with painting, these are very specific, right? Specifically defined categories. Um, I'm I don't know where I fit into it at all, but I am informed by all of these categories, whether it's conceptual abstraction, whether it's neo-expressionism, whether it's, you know, any number of tendencies and categories that we've put out there as a culture. Um, I am very informed by a lot of these things, but even if my work doesn't look like neo-expressionism, I am very informed by it because it's from my time as I've grown up and as I've developed, as I've been a cultural observer and consumer. But you know, it's a matter of just, I guess, over time you see exactly what you did, but that's not even for me to figure out.
I agree with that. As
Mhm.
you have collaborated on local level with many artisans, this continuum from one dualistic end of traditional arts to the other dualistic end of science is something we face immersing in your works. And we will circle back to this topic later under the section Art and Science towards the end. But for now, I wanted to ask you, do you enjoy making large scale works over small scale works? Would you like to explain how you decipher your materials and methods as a true multidisciplinary artist? If you have come up with a formula by now for your signature works in various forms, would you tell us more about this process?
Yeah, well, scale is you know, it's such a fun thing, and from my point of view, it's a great way of understanding the possibilities of things. I actually was focused on drawing for about 10 years. And that's how I got into paper making. I was really heavily involved in drawing for a good 10 years before I embarked on painting at a much more intentional level. And drawing, I started with very small drawings, you know, the size of a notebook sheet of paper, and eventually they became big sheets of paper the size of walls. And that led me to doing murals and things like that, wall drawings. And so with scale, I started discovering that I I take a lot longer working in a small scale, especially in painting, a small painting or a small drawing. It could take me a long time. Whereas working on a larger scale, there's all this kind of gestural freedom and all this movement, and you're using the body a lot more. You're climbing up and down ladders, you're sitting on the floor, standing up, kneeling down, stretching around, and it becomes this much more physical activity, which I really enjoy. And you know, going up and down scaffolding and even lifts and cranes and things like that, it's a little bit like you know, you're moving around in this area and being able to do more things. Whereas just sitting in the same position for hours or days and weeks and focusing on this very small visual area, and which also has its benefits. It's for me, it's like meditation. I do a lot of drawings where I feel like it's a type of meditation, or a lot of paintings where I'm very focused in a small area. So it's I don't have a formula per se, but I do tend to think that one serves drawing one scale serves one purpose and another scale serves a different purpose. And what I mean by that is that you're in different mind states. You're in different everything's just very, very different, and time passes much differently. And so, it's I've just kind of grown to get used to switching between scales. I'm kind of going big to small to medium to big again and back to small, and so I see it as a form of like a frequency, almost like like a wave, like the form of a wave, just going from scale to scale and up and down, and so that has a rhythm in itself. And I've looked now, it's funny, I started looking back recently at a lot of my work because we're working on this monograph. And when you start looking at 25 plus years of work, you start seeing how there is not perhaps a pattern, but there is a change of scale, and there's a change of color, and there's a change of material. And so you're kind of moving in and out of these different periods of time where you're working on lots and lots of little drawings, and then all of a sudden you're just working on a bunch of big paintings and big public projects. And so that's interesting to look back on, and start seeing how there's a, again, not a pattern, but a frequency, a kind of energy there of moving within one's own time and space.
Beautifully put. And I agree, it sounds very meditative. Let's take a moment to realize what we have been talking about through this video.
Mhm.
Bear with me.
That's a car horn. We don't want to hit any sheep. So this video is on the way. This is in the south shore of Lake Issyk-Kul in Kyrgyzstan. This is a very, very rural area. This is on the way to a studio that I had for several summers in a very small town called Barskon.
Mhm.
Barskon is in Kyrgyz language, means the leopard king. So this area is really fascinating because Lake Issyk-Kul is the second highest alpine lake in the world after Lake Titicaca in Peru and Bolivia. And so it's a high altitude, very, very uh, low in salt content. So it doesn't exactly freeze like Lake Baikal or other freshwater lakes, like the Great Lakes here in the US. It has a slight percentage of saltiness. So it stays, it doesn't freeze over the winter. And one of the things that attracted me to going to this part of the lake is that after Yuri Gagarin went to space, and usually astronauts come back and they have some time to rest, let their body recover from microgravity. He actually spent time in Barskon on a retreat for a couple of months. And so there's a monument to Yuri Gagarin there near this beautiful waterfall called the Barskon Waterfall. And it just so happened that I was able to get a studio there for several summers. And so that road where you see the sheep is on the way to the studio. But also there's a great history of felt making, and also people who make musical instruments, people who make carpets, people who make rugs, people who also work with wool and felt, not only for those kinds of pieces, but also for other clothing, for other purposes. So there's a lot of sheep in that area, and there's a lot of animals in that area. So, that's when I'm on that road, I'm like, oh God, now I'm really here. I'm not in New York. I am not in an airport. I'm really, really here. And it's this really long drive. And as the further you go towards Barscon, the more beautiful it is. And so you're just sort of emotionally and physically preparing yourself to just be in this other world that is just really peaceful, very beautiful.
Amazing. Here are some more installation shots from the show. Please bear with me.
Wait, so I'll go back to the last one.
Mhm.
So on the left side there, you see a piece made with a technique called chi. And what that is you take hand spun dyed wool and you hand spin it around these little reeds. And traditionally in Kyrgyzstan, these are to decorate the interiors of yurts. And they usually have scenes of traditional motifs like sheep and horses and mountains and people playing musical instruments in the great outdoors, things like that. And I just really wanted to experiment and say, I love all these vertical lines. And it reminded me of transistors. And I just wanted to try, how do I translate one of these watercolors into a cheap technique piece? And so that was really the first time I tried that. And it's a very, very slow, very meditative process. The pieces on the right are actually wool from the same area as you just saw that sheep, the video of the sheep trying to cross the street into the field with the shepherds. And so this was a group of pieces that I started around 2018 and worked into 2019 and finished during the pandemic in 2020. And so, it's great to see that video near this piece because there's a huge connection, obviously because of the material, but also in that time frame and that place itself.
They all have very captive titles with a history of its own. And here is my favorite textile work from Nepal. Bear with me. Lava Vectors 2018, alongside a paperwork reverberating similar concept. This is a hand-dyed, hand-woven Himalayan wool and bamboo silk in Tibetan knot technique made with 100 knots per square inch. And going back to our section on artistic process, how do you navigate the confluence of traditional and scientific elements in your work? Was this integration something you planned from the very beginning?
I think that when you study art history and when you study science, you see a lot of parallels. And so, going all the way back to ancient art, you look at what the Mayan astronomers, the way they were looking at things and how the local Mayan artisans were doing sculptures of stargazers, or you look at, medieval manuscripts painted by monks in Europe, looking at the stars, and so you have all these great examples throughout cultures globally that who are making art from scientific observation. So for me, it's just since a child, it was a natural leaning and inkling to really have a similar type of observation. And so with textiles and things like, microchips, there is a lineage. When you start studying the history of computers, you can really start with a hand knotted rug, or even going back to Peruvian quipus and looking at how human beings use knots to keep track of time or counting numbers. And so you move forward several centuries into, say, the Middle Ages, and where you're still doing weaving and knotting, and then you move into the jacquard loom, which brings you to punch cards, which brings you to adding machines, which brings you to early computers, which brings you to transistors and micro devices and microchips. And here we are talking on these screens with your laptop and my laptop, and we're all on our phones. And so turns out these screens actually have tiny strands of cotton inside of them as well. So all that lineage, there are people who study this, there's tons of books, and technological historians who know these things. But I feel like with art, it's not as obvious. And so I'm just literally connecting dots, or trying to connect some dots.
We will understand this integration more by looking at your work up close. This is, bear with me, this is your work Cosmodrome set from 2020. Just bear with me, I'm flipping the slide. And it is made from a pair of hand-dyed, hand-felted, laser-cut, hand-sewn Tian Shan mountain sheep's wool pieces in Kurak technique. Here is the key motif vector.
Mhm.
It is hard to imagine this motif is extracted from panoramic topographies like these of outer spaces. Would you elaborate on the origin of this motif and the significance, and how has this idea evolved over time?
Yeah, sure. Actually, go back to the black and white piece.
Mhm.
The vector shape itself, what happened was that I was looking at microchip circuitry. I visited an exhibition called Information Art Diagramming Microchips at the MoMA. And that show really, I was so young, I was 18 or 19. I was really, really captivated by this idea that these very, very tiny microscopic worlds were really shaping our lives in terms of communication and access to information. And I was really obsessed with, particularly, there was a hand-drawn diagram of a microchip made by Texas Instruments in the early 70s. And this was a huge sheet of vellum paper, literally drawn transistor by transistor by hand using colored pencils and ink pens and things like that. And those connections of the transistors, just visually, they were very stimulating. I'm stimulated by complexity. I love complexity in nature or in artifice, and visual complexity for some reason, has always been a very attractive thing to me. If things lack complexity, I lose interest pretty quickly. But having these giant drawings and photographs and large images of photographic images of microchips, seeing all that line work, seeing the logic behind the kind of line work, seeing the uh, the beauty, I thought, the beauty of so much organizational content, of so much logic behind something that's has a function. It was just very exciting. And I started doing all these drawings, and I was like, wow, I need to make my own microchip, and I need to start thinking about how to make what is that line? What is that connection that I can make for my work? I was so young. I was already kind of like trying to figure out like how to make sense of things. And so I was very curious. I was very curious how a shape, how a form could not only create a meaning, but how could you take a building block, a simple unit of something, and work with it and change it and shape it and replicate it and turn it inside out and create a positive and a negative space. And so I had all these questions very, very quickly at a very, very young age. And I just sort of stayed at it and kind of worked all that out. And I came up with this shape that I call vector, which I'm still using today. And it's a shape that, it can be in any number of patterns and directions and shapes. And I started quickly realizing that I could start creating all kinds of forms and patterns and compositions. And then I started realizing it could be positive, negative. So for this piece, you literally have the white wool on the left, and the black wool on the left. If you take all those pieces of black wool and you put them on the other piece with the other black shapes, you're going to fill it all into black. So this is basically a positive and a negative of each other, even though the image on the right is rotated. They are the same shapes, they are the same size. And so I was able to take sheets of black wool and a sheet of white wool, and using laser cutting with the same pattern, be able to cut out the same pattern on a black sheet and a white sheet, and then take the pieces out and transpose them from one piece into another. So that's how you get the set, the pair. And they're literally a pair of negatives with a positive and a pair of the positives with the negatives. And so having this, it's almost like a game, having this mathematical game to be solving. And so in a lot of my work, that's one of the fundamental aspects, is that there's a logic, there's a set of rules that I'm following. And so I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but if I follow those rules, I get the results. That also comes from, I read a book very influential to me called A New Kind of Science. And it's about cellular automata, and it's about how in mathematics, simple rules yield complex results. And cellular automata came from the study of fractals. And so when you study fractals, you start seeing repetitious patterns. But then if you introduce a deviation in that pattern, you start getting it starts yielding very, very complex results. And so these kinds of ideas from math, from nature, from science are really things that are helping me figure out how to do what I'm doing.
Wow, it's fascinating. Um, Now I'd like to show assembly sequence 21. Bear with me. Dated 2018. It is an embroidery and digital print on synthetic silk that mixes geometric abstraction as a gesture with shimmer on the same plane, while demystifying the notion of consonance and dissonance through this repetitive use of the same motif vector. Talking about conceptual themes, your work explores this interplay between consonance and dissonance in visual language, almost like cartographic lines, but derived from topographies of other planetary planes and spaces. How do you approach this exploration, and what does it signify in the context of your art?
Well, I think going back a little bit to what I was saying, I'm just very much curious about, how complex can things become? How can I take different ideas and work with them to create a type of visual complexity? In this piece, there was the conceptual challenge of it was that, I was taking very, very traditional materials like silk and applying new technologies where there's a digital print on the silk, which is on the background. There's some hand painting in there. The embroidery is by hand, which is very traditional. But the challenge of it was that I was told by the ladies that I was working with for the embroidery that this was going to be impossible, because the amount of times the needle has to go through the silk to be able to layer these different colors. So you have the white, then you have this maroon, the red, the orange, and the yellow. There's actually some overlap. In some areas, there's two colors on top of one another, and with the white. And so this is a very risky proposition in terms of like execution with the material. And so these are the kind of things that, you know, I I think about it conceptually, yes, but also there's the reality side, right? There's the material side, which is very, very challenging. And so it's a risk, you know, we took this risk, we have a limited amount of time, you know, and we say, you know, if this gets cut, if this gets damaged, this piece is done, it's over. You can't be having pieces that are damaged as final pieces. So there's a lot of factors at play to be able to do something like this. And then besides the physical aspect, of course, there's the conceptual part, which is mixing, again, digital technologies with traditional materials and traditional techniques. And what does that mean? How do you, you know, how do you even arrive at that? And so that just comes again from my own curiosities and having an understanding of these digital technologies, but also having an understanding by learning from the artisans of what is possible and what's not possible. I usually like to try really seemingly impossible things. And you know, that's a space that I operate in quite comfortably in the unknown. But again, there's a lot of risk involved, but I think that it's worth it.
It's evident that you accept challenges as it comes. Now I'd like to move towards your earlier work. And my question is, um, many of your earlier works, such as lava vectors and thermal vectors, involve this use of technical and scientific data. What does using skills and resources of the current technological movements and traditional artisanship at the same time mean for your interpretation?
Well, I think that, you know, I think there's so many cases of where you can look at an ancient technology and apply it to still learn something new. And so I always feel like we can still learn from the ancient peoples, from ancient technologies, from indigenous cultures. I feel like there's always something that we're learning and that can even we can use current technologies to apply it with. So that's a whole interesting field that I pay attention to. And I think there's more and more of it being exposed in terms of how you again take ancient knowledge and apply it through new technologies today.
Mhm. There is that sense of continuum. I definitely agree. Let's take a deeper dive into exhibitions and collaborations now. I'd like to share the slide of your previous exhibition. This is the installation Cosmos Codex at Matla, California from spring 2014. At the very inception of this first sculptural art show with site-specific installation called Cosmos Codex, we could see you have included a collaborative film piece and other sculptural works engaging with aerospace themes. How did you go about collaborating with NASA experts, and what were some of the most enlightening moments during this process?
Yeah, so this was a really challenging commission. I was approached by the curator of MACLA at the time, Monica Ramirez Montagu, who's now the executive director at the Parish Art Museum in Watermill in Long Island. And Monica approached me about doing a residency at NASA. And through the MACLA, what had happened is that in San Jose, California, they had had the 01 biennial, which was about technology and having all these tech companies and tech firms do collaborations with artists and do public programming and public projects. And the San Jose Museum of Art and MACLA and other institutions had done this sort of like citywide biennial, and which was very successful. And one of the things that happened was that the director of the 01 biennial had mentioned to the MACLA that my work would be really great to present to NASA. Not only because of my biographical background, but because of the subject matter. So MACLA and I proposed to NASA to do a type of residency. Unfortunately, NASA didn't do artist in residency programs anymore. They had cut that funding because of congressional issues that arose from previous NASA art funding. And so what happened was that NASA said, well, we can't exactly do a traditional residency with you, but what we can do is have you come see us, have you visit us, and have this very, you could say almost like a dialogue, so to speak, have this daily dialogue went on for several months. But first, you need to tell us what you need to know. Number two, why you need to know what you want to know. And number three is, what are you going to do with what you want to know? So I had to state my case, defend my case, and justify what and why I needed to go talk to them. So that went on for a while. I had to make a presentation and kind of like an interview, sort of, but with the powers that be. And they basically told me, they replied to us and they basically said, well, we believe you're versed enough to come to NASA Ames, which meant, we think you know what you're talking about. Because I was asking for very specific information. I wanted to know a lot about Mars exploration. I wanted to know a lot about material sciences. I wanted to experience the wind tunnels and some of the laboratories, and I wanted to speak to specific scientists. So I did all this research to tell them what I wanted to do. And so the only thing I was not allowed to do was to visit the wind tunnels, because at that time they were being used by the Air Force for classified research. Otherwise, they gave me really amazing access every day from like 8 in the morning to 5 p.m. I was just literally bombarded with amazing information. So I talked to scientists who were working with Mars exploration, growing food in space, living and working in space. How do you eat? How do you sleep? How do you use the bathroom? How do you live your daily life? How do you exercise? That kind of subjects. What are the effects of the body, the effects of space on the body? Meaning, what happens to your brain fluid? What happens to your eyeballs? What happens to your blood pressure and your circulatory cardiovascular system and your digestive system? And how does your esophagus know how to swallow in microgravity? So I was meeting incredible, what are called principal and lead investigators. So these are scientists who are heading specific research programs that have been approved, that have been funded by NASA to move forward to their either missions or purely research. And it was just this very intense, very fascinating time to be able to go there and learn so much. It was overwhelming. I was coming back to the apartment and in San Jose every evening, like, wow, like what, just blown away. And digesting all those things to be able to produce a body of work. So those was an incredible journey. And so the exhibition itself, I did a collaborative film with a great filmmaker from Slovakia named Barbara Beresnakova, award-winning filmmaker now. And so I also collaborated with the MACLA to produce a bunch of pieces, some paintings. We did the sculptural installation. We even did rubbings of lunar craters from the original models of the dark side of the moon, that were made using satellite photography of the moon back in the early 60s. I worked with a couple of people from NASA, particularly a woman named Dr. Yvonne Clearwater, who specialized in the development of how to live in space in the 70s and 80s with Skylab and Space Shuttle. So, they're having all this information with people like that, I was able to produce some works that I was trying to reflect on, again, the complexity of those realities and what that kind of work that they do. But specifically the materials that I used in that exhibition, especially for that central kind of diorama installation, are materials that are used for spacecraft, for hardware. And also there's a Martian regolith simulant, which is a type of iron ore dust that simulates the surface of Mars. So yeah, it was just quite a adventure in California.
Wow. Now, moving on to our overall queries on art and science, your work uniquely intersects art and science. How do you see these disciplines complementing each other, and what message do you hope to convey through this synthesis?
I think that, so far my experience and part of your question sort of brings me back a little bit to what I learned at NASA Ames from scientists, is that there's in society, there's this huge separation typically between art and between science. Art is seen as something so loose and free and aloof and kind of like uh somewhat, the stereotype is that, an artist is sort of like this loose cannon, and they're kind of like out to lunch, and they're just sort of like very undisciplined. And at the same time, people see scientists as these very rigid, very linear thinking, kind of, going through life to do their research and their discoveries, with the blinders on, where they don't look at anything else. And so there are some truths to those stereotypes, but also, there are a lot of scientists who, for example, are very religious. There are scientists who are really into art. There are scientists who look at art to see the parallels between the way an artist thinks and a scientist thinks. Einstein being the most famous, he said that the success of his research was because of creativity and being open-minded and looking at things just from multiple points of view. And so I feel that, there's not enough artists looking at things from a scientific perspective. And I think there's a lot of scientists who are also just sort of too closed up. And so I feel that the field of art and science, which is very small, it's very prevalent more in Western countries, has to do with a culture of curiosity. I feel fortunate that, I sort of have that within me to begin with, but that there are support systems for doing this type of work and this type of research. And so I feel like it's a field that's just really, really in its infancy. That's not to say that it never happened before, because if you go back all the way to the Renaissance and before, you've always had artists working with scientists in every culture. So it's just a matter of, I think the public perception has its disbalances.
Now, I'd like to ask you about future directions. How do you see your work evolving in the next decade, especially with rapid advancements in space exploration and technology with AI?
Yeah, I actually I'm getting more and more interested in elements of design, not only with textiles, but also in terms of architecture, in terms of, you know, basically all the mediums I work with. I'm just very excited about how they can evolve. Even just drawing, what is a drawing? What can a drawing do? What can you use in a drawing? Painting, of course, painting is always evolving. But I'm also, as I'm having more and more the privilege of working with public art, very interested in, again, new materials, how you can apply different technologies and new technologies, new ideas to different materials. In a way, I'm just always expanding my scope, and at the same time, really having each of those elements of the entire scope expand upon themselves, and maybe some parts will cross over. I think that ultimately I'll have to create a space where I have all these different materials in one place.
Would you like to name a few projects or themes you are excited to explore in your upcoming works?
Well, what I want to do this coming year is I really want to think about getting back to very, very large scale painting. And I want to try much, much larger scale textiles. And it's really for the challenges of the materials, pushing the limits of different techniques and different materials. But I'm also moving into sculptural realms. I've started doing some tests with stone and marble and doing laser and digital carving on stone. So, it's just a matter of keep experimenting.
Now on to our final question. I remember us discussing about Annie Alber's collaboration with John Cage for her textile works and thought how radical of a thought it was back then. Going back to the very context of producing textile work, how important is bridging or intersecting past and the present and one paradigm to the other paradigm for Latin American art and global textile art today? Would you explain that to our audience as a parting note?
Well, I think that having a good understanding of art history, I think every artist should have a very, very keen understanding of art history and how their work may fit or may not fit into that paradigm. In terms of Latin American history and textiles, I mean, that's such a rich history going back to indigenous cultures in the Amazon and in the Andes and rural Mexico and even here in North America. So I look at a lot of that kind of work as this very complex geometric patterning that, as we know, has been used in some newer technologies. For example, for the Apollo space program, the semiconductor microchips that were being developed here in the US by a company called Fairchild Semiconductor in New Mexico were using Navajo weavers, pretty much mostly women, to do the intricate tying and knotting of the transistor wires for the microchips. So, that's just one example, but we can definitely always look back and always look at how people have been able to do incredible work with their hands and then still do that similar work with their hands for even newer technologies. There's a company in Florida that I've been researching who works with thermal insulation blanket materials for spacecraft and space telescope development. And it's mostly women who are doing literally cutting and sewing thermal insulation material for spacecraft. And one of them was an origami teacher. Another one was a pattern dressmaker from, a rural town in the South. And then you have people who worked before, and one had a gift wrapping department at Macy's. And, so there's all these very interesting applications of everyday sort of tasks that can be applied to new technologies, new ideas.
Thank you, Rafa, for your amazing narratives. And thank you all for tuning in, and especially Isabella at Hutchinson for giving us this opportunity to discuss in depth. Take care and
Thank you. Thanks.
see you soon, Rafa. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Bye.